Once upon a time, in a bustling city known for its towering skyscrapers and vibrant streets, there existed a courtroom that was the center of a gripping tale of deceit and redemption. This story revolves around the high-profile case of Mr. Johnson versus the State, a riveting courtroom drama that captured the hearts and minds of everyone who followed it. It was an unusually hot summer, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the cobbled streets as crowds gathered outside the elegant courthouse. Reporters mingled with curious onlookers, eager to catch a glimpse of the lawyers, witnesses, and the defendant himself. Mr. Charles Everett, a distinguished and well-liked businessman, who now stood accused of embezzling millions from his own company. Mr. Andrew Johnson, a rising star in the legal world, had been entrusted with the defense. He was young, ambitious, and had a reputation for taking on the most challenging cases, fighting for truth and justice. As he entered the courtroom, he was met with a wave of murmurs. Speculation filled the air. Most people believed Mr. Everett was guilty. The odds were stacked against him, but Mr. Johnson was undeterred. He had faith in his client's innocence. The trial had become a media sensation, drawing interest not only because of the charges, but also due to Mr. Everett's notable position in the community. He was a beloved figure, having founded a successful tech company that supported numerous charitable initiatives. To many, it seemed unfathomable that he could betray his values and the people who had supported him. Mr. Johnson stood tall as the courtroom settled, addressing the jury with sincerity. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. Today, I will demonstrate that my client, Mr. Everett, is innocent of the charges brought against him. This case isn't just about numbers and documents. It's about character, trust, and the true essence of justice." He glanced at Mr. Everett, who sat nervously at the defense table, hoping for a sign of reassurance. The prosecution, led by Ms. Jennifer Blake, was equally formidable. She was known for her tenacity and sharp wit, a lawyer who had built a career on securing convictions. As she rose to make her opening statement, the tension in the room intensified. "Your Honor, jury members, we will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Everett manipulated the financial records of his company for personal gain. We have irrefutable evidence, and the truth will come to light." The trial began with testimonies from employees and financial experts, each painting a picture of Mr. Everett as a greedy executive who betrayed the very foundation of his company. Among them was Rebecca, a former accountant who had worked closely with Everett. "I witnessed irregularities in the financial reports," she stated firmly. "Mr. Everett was responsible for approving the transactions. He seemed involved in everything, and I feared he was hiding something." Mr. Johnson listened intently, mentally preparing for the cross-examination. As Rebecca stepped down, he rose and approached her. "Ms. Thompson, you mentioned that you feared Mr. Everett was hiding something. Can you provide concrete evidence to support your claim?" Rebecca paused. "I can't provide documentation, but I just had a gut feeling." "Thank you, Ms. Thompson. So, you admit it's merely a feeling, not a fact," he pressed, his voice steady. The jury exchanged glances, unsure what to make of her testimony. Mr. Johnson knew he had to create reasonable doubt. Days passed, and the courtroom drama unfolded like a well-scripted play. Each witness brought more layers to the case, but Mr. Johnson remained focused on building his defense. He shared personal stories about Mr. Everett, drawing attention to his extensive community service, donations to local charities, and how he had mentored young entrepreneurs. "This is not the profile of a man who would sacrifice his integrity," Mr. Johnson asserted, looking directly at the jury. However, the prosecution was relentless. Each day, they pushed harder, presenting financial records that seemed damning. Mr. Johnson felt the pressure mounting, but he was determined to uncover evidence that could exonerate his client. He spent nights poring over paperwork, searching for discrepancies, clues, and anything that could turn the tide. On the seventh day of the trial, an unexpected ray of hope appeared. A subpoena had been issued for Mr. Lawson, Mr. Everett's former business partner, who had abruptly left the company shortly after the allegations surfaced. Law enforcement had been unable to locate him, but Mr. Johnson received an anonymous tip that Lawson might be hiding in a nearby town. Risking his own reputation, Mr. Johnson took the leap and arranged a search for him. His instincts told him that Lawson held critical information that could change everything. As the sun set behind him, he drove into the neighboring town, excited by the possibility of finding the missing piece of the puzzle. After hours of searching, he discovered Lawson living in a modest apartment, a shadow of his former self. The two men faced each other in the cramped living room. "What do you want, Johnson?" Lawson sneered, hostility radiating from him. "I need to talk to you about Mr. Everett," Mr. Johnson replied, trying to keep his composure. "You know the truth. You know what really happened." At first, Lawson was defensive, but as Mr. Johnson pressed him, the facade began to crack. "Why should I help you? I barely escaped that mess," Lawson responded, his voice trembling with emotion. "Because it's the right thing to do," Mr. Johnson countered earnestly. "If you tell the truth, you can clear an innocent man's name. Isn't that worth something?" After a tense conversation, Lawson sighed and relented. "Fine. I'll tell you everything, but you need to promise me protection." "I don't want to go back to prison," Mr. Johnson agreed, and with that, Lawson divulged shocking information about how he had manipulated the financial records and set Mr. Everett up to take the fall. "I initiated the transfers without his knowledge and forged his signature on documents. I was the one pulling the strings," Lawson admitted, trembling as he spoke. Racing back to the city, Mr. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling of exhilaration and dread at what he had discovered. He immediately contacted the court the next morning, requesting an emergency hearing to introduce this new evidence. Inside the courtroom, Judge Thomas looked incredulous but curious. "Mr. Johnson, this is highly unconventional. The trial is nearly at its conclusion. I understand Your Honor, but this is a matter of justice and an innocent man's freedom. Mr. Lawson is prepared to testify, and I believe what he has to say will be critical for the jury," Mr. Johnson argued passionately. The judge considered the plea and ultimately granted the request. With anticipation in the air, Mr. Lawson was brought before the jury, visibly shaken but resolute. As he stepped onto the witness stand, the atmosphere was electric. "Mr. Lawson," Mr. Johnson began, "can you tell us why you left the company?" I was scared. I knew the walls were closing in on me, and someone had to take fall. I knew if I left, the focus would shift to Everett, and people would believe he orchestrated it all," Lawson admitted, his voice shaking. "How did you accomplish this?" Mr. Johnson pressed. "I created false documents, manipulated the financial statements, and made sure they pointed directly to him," Lawson said, eyes glistening. The room was silent, the impact of the confession settling heavily among everyone present. Ms. Blake, visibly rattled, attempted to counter, but she stumbled over her words. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We have no corroboration to substantiate Mr. Lawson's claims," she insisted, trying to regain control of the situation. But the damage had been done. The jury, now aware of Lawson's deception, whispered among themselves, and even Judge Thomas seemed taken aback by the sudden turn of events. The trial continued, but the momentum had shifted completely. Mr. Johnson used the newfound evidence to tear apart the prosecution's case, methodically dismantling every accusation. Every time Ms. Blake attempted to spin a narrative of guilt, Mr. Johnson countered with facts and testimony that painted a far different picture. As the trial drew to a close, Mr. Johnson stood once again before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you've heard the truth. My client is not just an innocent man. He is a victim of a cruel betrayal, expertly orchestrated by someone he trusted. I urge you to see beyond the deception and return with a verdict of not guilty." The panel of jurors nodded in response, their expressions grave yet thoughtful. They filed out of the courtroom for what felt like an eternity, the weight of their decision looming over everyone. After several hours that stretched like years, the jury returned. The room fell silent as they took their seats and the foreman stood. Your Honor, we have reached a verdict. Please state the verdict, Judge Thomas announced, and every eye was on the foreman, awaiting the outcome. We, the jury, find the defendant, Mr. Charles Everett, not guilty on all charges. A wave of shock followed, then erupted into applause. Mr. Everett embraced his lawyer, overwhelmed with emotion. He could hardly believe that justice had prevailed at such a dire moment. Tears streamed down his face as gratitude flowed through him like a river. In the aftermath, once the celebrations died down, Mr. Johnson knew that his victory was deeply significant. It wasn't just about winning a case. It was about restoring a man's dignity and reaffirming the principles of justice in his community. The case of Mr. Johnson versus. The state became a landmark trial, and Mr. Johnson's career soared to new heights. Months passed, but the story remained ever present in legal circles and among the townsfolk. Mr. Johnson received requests from other defendants who had lost hope, believing that he was a beacon of justice in a sometimes harsh world. One fateful evening, while attending a charity gala hosted by Mr. Everett, Johnson found himself reflecting on the journey he had undertaken. The hall was adorned with lights that glimmered like stars, and the air was filled with laughter and warmth. "You did well, Andrew," Mr. Everett said as he approached. "You fought for me when no one else would. It wasn't just me. It was the truth that needed to be heard. I merely had the privilege of being your advocate," Mr. Johnson replied modestly. "You're the reason I have my life back," Mr. Everett insisted. "Because of you, I'm able to rebuild my company and continue helping our community." As they chatted, Mr. Johnson felt a sense of fulfillment. The experience had changed him as well. He had found his calling, fighting for the voiceless, standing against injustice. In the months that followed, Mr. Johnson's practice flourished, but he remained grounded, always looking to give back. He organized legal workshops in schools, teaching students about justice and advocacy. He became a mentor himself, guiding young law students who were eager to enter the world of law with integrity and determination. Eventually, as the years rolled by, Mr. Johnson became a noteworthy figure in the legal community, known not just for his victories, but for his unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth. He carried the lessons learned from the trial close to his heart, continuing to believe that the pursuit of justice was more than just a profession. It was a calling. Today, Mr. Johnson stands not just as a lawyer, but as a guardian of ethics and integrity in the legal arena. As he gazes out at the bustling city from his office window, he remembers the courtroom, the trials, and the triumphs that brought him here. And so, the story of Mr. Johnson versus. The state serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes, in the darkest of times, truth prevails. It is a tribute to the idea that justice is worth fighting for, no matter how long or challenging the path may be. In the cycles of chaos and calm, there is always a flicker of hope waiting to emerge. And as the sun sets on another day in the city, Mr. Andrew Johnson reflects on his journey, one that transformed not only the life of one man, but also the essence of justice within his community. He knows that as long as there are people who believe in fairness, there will always be a chance for a new beginning, and he remains ever committed to that noble pursuit.